Okay, good afternoon. My name is Peter Manness. I work at M&P as a farm management consultant. I've been working at M&P working with producers doing risk management analysis, business planning, farm succession planning for 13 years. I've lived in Brandon for the past 7. So today the title of my presentation is Risky Business, sorting through some of your risk management options. I get we put these presentations and these titles together. I was telling Stephanie earlier, we come up with these great ideas way back in September of how it's going to work. And then the government changes all the rules, during Ag Days. So we're going to try and, completely revamp my presentation and figure all that out. I work as a farm management consultant. So we are not accountants, work along with our accountants at M&P to provide planning services and help provide some answers for your farm business. So there was a survey that realagriculture.com put out in September asking what ag policy changes do you want to see the next federal government focus on. And if you can, I'm not sure, you can see that pretty good. You can see there that out of 1,200, I think about 1,200 applicants is that farm financial and farm business risk management services were number 2 on that list. Number 1 was trade issues. But it's interesting. All the talk in the news right now is obviously about trade. What's the second most important thing that's in the news right now? Starts with a C. Carbon tax. We're going to talk about carbon tax. No, but all this talk about it, but it's not. It's a concern and it's on the list, but it still is behind farm business sustainability and succession, and farm financial stability and business risk management, which is the 2 areas that I focus in. So it's out there, it's important, but it's not, to me, it never gets as much press as it should get. Go. There we go. So if you look at some of the financial trends that are happening with grain farms in Manitoba, is that if we look at this time period between from 2018 back 5 years, is that we've really had a pretty good run. 14 was not very good. That we saw that gross margin dip, but overall we've seen this increasing trend in gross margin, in profitability. Obviously, still seeing an increase in costs in our labor, power, machinery costs, and land building and finance costs, but we've been able to kind of outpace that from a profitability standpoint. Now, I think that as we look and see what's happened in 2019, we've seen the prices come down a little bit. Obviously, cost numbers continue to rise. We've had some harvest challenges that go into that also. So I think there's this expectation that that trend is going to come down. But overall, it has been a relatively good period of time. So if you then kind of take that and look at what has happened from a yield perspective, and it's really what's kind of carried this profitability and how we've been able to manage through this challenge, is that you can see that there has been this consistent trendline yield increase in, if we look at our 3 major crops, which is red spring wheat, canola, and soybeans, has been pretty consistent over time. And if you actually look within this data, you can actually see that those numbers are actually accelerating. And so I just was reading the press release from the minister's discussion yesterday about crop insurance and the changes that are coming there. And he talked about how there's this acceleration of our major crops and the yield curves, and I was kind of like, I knew it, but then there's nobody in the room to hear me say that. So I think that it's exciting and it's good news for advisors and producers, because the government is looking for opportunities and is seeing this change. But if you think back, if you look at that graph, kind of back in that 2006 time period, which is when I started at M&P, the yield trend at that time was just over 40 bushels an acre for red spring wheat. So if we think of, our historical products like crop insurance and agri-stability, while 80% of 43 is just a little over 32. Well, that same yield in 2019 trend is 56 bushels an acre is what we're expecting on spring wheat. And so I think that we take that number times 80%, and our exposure, if you think about it in absolute dollar value, is significantly higher than it was in 2006. And we've obviously had significant weather challenges and weather events, but have they been, now I don't know, we might argue that 19 was something that we'd never seen before. But, I farmed, I tell you about the time that I grew soybeans, which was somewhere around like right here. But we've had those weather events before, so something is happening, right? That we're able to manage through some of these challenges, still be able to keep this, still be able to keep on this trend line yield increase as we move forward. So as you can see, if you look at red spring wheat, is that we're increasing at over a bushel per acre in terms of trend line yield. Canola is 0.82 bushels an acre. Soybeans is 0.74, and then corn and Canadian Northern hard red on the end there. If you go back to 2016 and do the same calculation, is that canola at that point was at 0.44 bushels an acre. So almost an extra half a bushel an acre in the last 5 years that we've really seen that those yield trends are going up. And again, that's, there's smart people in the back rooms at Crop Insurance running the same analysis that we are. So I think that they're seeing the same things. That's why we're seeing some changes in these programs. So what's happening then is if we look at just kind of a historical 80% coverage level from a crop insurance standpoint, is that our actual coverage based on where our yield trends are is that we're running less than 70%. And if we think about, again, the changes that we've seen with agri-stability, is that there's some benefit of those historical prices, but our exposure just continues to get wider. So how do we manage that, and how do we, what do we do? So some things that are things about risk management is that the options for risk management will continue to increase and will only get more complicated. And this slide, I put together 5 years ago, and it still continues to be. It's the reason that we've seen changes from crop insurance. It's the reason we've seen some changes to agri-stability, and it's the reason that we've got private insurance companies that are in trying to provide insurance services for farmers. You cannot completely cover all of your costs and perils with one insurance product. Certainly for grain farmers in Manitoba, there isn't one insurance that is going to completely eliminate all the risk, and I'm not certain that you need to do that anyways. You can have obviously too little insurance, but you can have too much insurance also. Is that risk is the opportunity, and so we think about it from the bad perspective, but I also often joke that working with accountants is that accountants think of risk as bad and farmers think of risk as good. But that's where the opportunity is in your business, and so trying to find that balance between that cost benefit for the insurance product you're looking at. And ultimately is that you're not your neighbor. So your risk tolerance, your profitability, your farming practices, despite the fact that you think that you're all the same, is you're all different, and all of those factors come into play in terms of deciding how to establish how much risk is appropriate. So what are the right questions? So an example. Recently, my wife and myself, daughter was involved a little bit, is that we needed to purchase a new car. So we went out and looked for a new vehicle for ourselves, and we found we were looking for something that was well-equipped, safe, reliable, and efficient. So if you're looking for a family vehicle, do you think that something that's well, reliable, safe, and efficient would be a good choice? Who thinks that would be a good choice for their family? Great. You buy yourself a Chevy Aveo. this obviously is not going to work for our family. It might work for some people, but it's certainly not going to work for ours. So what did we do wrong? So we bought a well-equipped, safe, reliable, efficient vehicle. What did we do wrong? What did we forget to ask? How big is it? Yeah. How does it drive in the snow? Can you fit a car seat in the back seat? Right? Like, those are important questions. So if we then redid that with some of those additional questions, we might find that we get something that's a little bit bigger. And for our family, we've got one child. We probably could fit into a Jeep Cherokee like this one. But if you've got 3 or 4 kids, you might find that you need something a little bit bigger or a little bit bigger. So we can ask good questions that we did when we tried to buy this car, but it doesn't mean that we've asked the right questions. And I think that that is really important when it comes to deciding what risk management programs work for your farm. So the first question, and we think about the right questions, is how much is the risk profile on your farm changing? And I think that this is an important piece to understand, is that it is changing. So even though you think that it isn't, it is. And so obviously as advisors, we want to quantify things, but how much is that profile actually changing for your farm? What are the implications of more or less production risk or price risk to your farm operation? And then what is an acceptable amount of financial risk exposure for you to have each year? And how do you decide what that number is? So to me, those are the 3 important questions that we need to be asking. Whether you're a grain farm, whether you're a cattle operation, is how is it changing? What's the implications of more or less price or production risk? And what is the right amount of risk exposure for us to have? So one of the things that we do with producers is trying to quantify what that risk is. So looking at our total cost of production, thinking about, as we move from left to right on that graph, thinking about the implications of our production, either a combination of our production and price going down from 100% of our expected yield and price to 90, 80, 70 accordingly, and then looking at how some of those things would fit into place. So if we have crop insurance, if we have agri-stability, how do those come into play? How do they work as we experience more and more production challenges or production or price impacts? And then ultimately what this gap is. And that's really what our exposure is. So once we know what our exposure is, then we can then look at the other pieces of our business to decide how we're going to deal with that and the implications of what would happen if we experience one of these challenges. So obviously there's some risk management tools that are out there, like agri-stability and agri-invest, crop insurance and hail insurance. There's also some private insurance products that are out specifically for grain farms. Such as Global Agri Solutions. There's another product called Just Solutions. But I think with the changes to agri-stability now is that we're going to see more and more. So again, more and more options for producers to work through and trying to understand. There's also other pieces that come into this as well. So, thinking about forward contracting and options. Options is really just a price insurance product. So how does that fit in? If we look at our crop selection and using something like a cash advance to help to manage some of that risk, how do those kind of work themselves together for our overall risk profile? I think what often happens is that we think about risk management and we automatically think about what it costs. And cost is obviously an important function of that, but if we were only worried about cost, then we would just insure ourselves. And that may be an option for you, but for most producers, especially if you have a business partner known as your bank, they might be a little bit interested in you covering off some of the cost. The flip side can also happen too, is that we can purchase a bunch of products and end up on the other side where we've eliminated a significant amount of that gap, but the cost to that we've become kind of prohibitive on the other side. And so really trying to find that right balance for our operation and the implications of the decision related to those insurance products. We talk a lot about production insurance, whether it's agri-stability, crop insurance, and really they exist almost entirely in that operation side of our business. But that's only one part of our business. This is the balanced scorecard, really dividing our operation into 4 different quadrants. And risk management as a whole comes into play with that. So, as I said, we focus a lot in operations, in crop insurance, with agri-stability. But how does that impact the risk profile in our other pieces? If we're carrying more debt and we have higher financial risk, then it might force us to try and reduce our production risk and our marketing risk. And in the same factor as the flip side is also true. If we have low financial risk, then maybe we can afford to carry more production risk. Maybe we can afford to carry more market risk because we're not as strapped from a financial standpoint. And so really key to not get too bogged down in just the production side of the risk profile, but just understanding how we need to deal with them together. If we're prepared to carry more production risk because it's happening anyways, then maybe we need to offset it in some other manner from a finance or a marketing side. The easiest way for us to manage our risk is to reduce costs, or to increase our efficiency, sorry. So we can reduce costs, which is the least fun thing to do, but it's an important part and one thing that we should be looking at as an industry, as producers. Budgeting review, capital management. Option to increase our land base, so that's going to help to lower our costs, increase our efficiency, but there's also risk associated with that in terms of more acres that we've got to cover, and ultimately increasing our gross margin as well. So focusing on marketing, maybe more intensive farming practices, looking at changing crops or increasing yield. So the trends that we're seeing, and I've covered this a little bit before, is that we've seen some evolution in crop insurance to include new types of coverage, such as whole farm coverage. We had the announcement yesterday in terms of some changes to Manitoba crop insurance, that they're looking to improve the coverage for producers. We've got these private sector risk management tools that are out there. The significant changes that we saw to agri-stability in that 2013 to 2017 period related to one of the big changes was the limited reference margins and these continual program changes that we've seen. There's a big change that was out just in the past number of weeks before Christmas in terms of the 2020 agri-stability changes, is that the big changes that we've got is that private insurance payments would not be considered allowable for purposes of calculating agri-stability benefits. It includes programs, they said, like GARS and Just Solutions. It also includes private hail. There's an understanding that the Manitoba hail insurance would also be part of that because the premiums aren't subsidized, but I'm not 100% certain on that. But then also some other insurance like the livestock price insurance program also would be considered as part of that. And then payments will be included in the reference period as we go forward to help to boost that historical reference margin. So all this kind of information is, where do we start? What is an acceptable insurance gap is the first question. So important pieces: consider your working capital, risk tolerance, etc. Somebody asked me today or just before about what that number is, and I would say that if you're looking for a number, is that you'd like your working capital to be at least 2 times what your annual exposure is. So if your annual exposure, say, is $50 an acre and you farm 2,000 acres, which means your exposure is, not good at doing math in my head, $100,000. So 2 times that would be $200,000 of working capital. Again, thinking about what the worst case scenario is, a percentage of your expected yield and price. I often ask producers, what year is the worst year? Some will tell me it was 2011 or 2004, the frost of 2004, or 2019 where we left all of our crop out in the field. It's just helped to understand what it was, and then it's easier for you to model. Well, what had happened in that year? Well, prices were here. We got 60% of our expected crop, and this is what the worst case scenario would be. How would each insurance product work? Obviously on its own, but ultimately how would they work together? And I think that that's one of the big things about the recent changes to agri-stability, is that there's an opportunity for us to reduce some of that overlap from an insurance standpoint. And does your current insurance match your farming practices? There's no point in buying insurance that doesn't match how you run your operation. So this is just an example of the risk management projector, which is what we do with producers, but really trying to model all of those things that we talked about and kind of put them all in together and see what kind of numbers it spits out. Ultimately, as you look at this graph, the higher you go up this graph with any insurance product, the more expensive it's going to get. So if we come back to the issue about cost, if you're trying to pick your insurance product strictly based on cost, then automatically you're going to end up down here. And you're going to end up with a whole bunch of products that are going to cover you for some type of biblical disaster, which may be what you're shooting for, but for most producers you're not. So there's no point in saying, well, I look at this is great insurance, but I'm going to pay, I only want to spend $6 an acre, so that's what I'm going to spend, and end up with a whole bunch of excess insurance down here at the bottom. Ultimately, we're trying to manage this gap, and the higher that we get, then in any insurance is the more expensive it's going to get. It's part of the reason why AgriStability made the change to reduce that tier 2 from 85 to 70%. So if we can look at that, if we can reduce some of this overlap that we see at the bottom, then hopefully it allows us to try and work our way up higher in this graph to be able to reduce that gap. And if we can't reduce that gap, then we need to be prepared to look at how does our working capital work according to that. If we were to have a bad year or 2 bad years, how would that impact our working capital? Would we still be able to operate? What would be the financial challenges that we would have? So just to kind of come back and summarize to where I started, is thinking about these 3 questions for your farm operation. How much of the risk is the risk profile in your farm changing? What are the implications of more or less price or production risk for your farm? And what is an acceptable amount of financial risk exposure for you to have? So with that, I'll leave my contact information as well as my colleague Javier Vargas that also works with me doing risk management analysis. And I would take some questions if I didn't go too long. Oh, I usually go too long. Any brave souls? All right. Well, I will be at our booth after this. If there's anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask, and that I can answer them there, it's just around the corner in the Westman Concourse. Thank you to Ag Days for the opportunity to come and speak today.
On behalf of Manitoba Ag Days, we'd like to thank MNP for the sponsorship of this room for our program, and thank you to Peter for being here with us today. So thank you very much.